And thanks for everyone for coming. It's really great to have so many registrations. I'll just get into it. So the title of the talk kind of says it all. I'll talk about the concept of grip, and specifically predictive processing takes upon it. I'll apply that account to schizophrenia, and I'll discuss the problem of representation hunger. And basically what I'll argue is that grip in non-schizophrenic experience is non-representational. Schizophrenic experience can be understood representationally. And if you have this view, you sort of deflate the problem of representation hunger. In a bit more detail, the outline of the argument would be to first briefly introduce predictive processing and my take on it. Then I will outline a popular phenomenological account of schizophrenia, how predictive processing typically explains schizophrenia, and how, if you combine these views, predictive processing allows for you to sort of operationalize the phenomenological account, hence you get a neurophenomenological account. Then, and probably the key part of the argument, is that I'm going to argue that the reason there's a move from a non-representational way of being when schizophrenia is not present to a representational mode of being, I'm going to argue that is underwritten by a change in the functional job description of the predictive processing architecture. Essentially, it's typically best described non-representationally, but whenever schizophrenia occurs, that turns to representational. It's better described representationally, and precision weighting plays a key role in that, as I'll explain later. And then finally, I'll just explain that what results is a positive disjunctivist account, which seems promising on its own. And also this account seems to deflate a lot of the scaling up concerns. At the very least, it puts the account on a par with rival representational views, and it might even be better. So yeah, that's the idea. So we'll just start off then. Predictive processing. What I'll do is briefly introduce predictive processing, and then the important points will be my take on it. Regina already, which was very helpful, already described predictive processing in depth, so I don't need to go too much into it. But essentially, the idea behind predictive processing is that the brain or the cognitive system is constantly trying to predict what's going to happen next. And the better and more accurate its predictions are over the long term, the better things are for the cognitive system. So a kind of simple way to put it is that the cognitive system will predict happiness and warmth and pleasure and all good kind of things, and just do its utmost to make sure those predictions are met. And when something happens that means that there's a divergence from those predictions, it will do things to turn things back the way. So you predict you're very warm, around 38 degrees centigrade. If your temperature starts to drop or get higher, it diverges from the prediction, then you do things to bring that prediction back on track. That's the idea. There are three key posits of predictive processing. One, predictions. They are passed down in neurohierarchy, as you saw from the Regina's diagram. Predictions are passed down the hierarchy and just essentially predict what should happen in the next level of the hierarchy. So one layer of the brain might pass a prediction to the next layer, expecting X and saying that X should be the case. That would be the prediction that's passed down. Errors then are just passed up, and they signal whether or not the prediction was correct or to what extent it was correct. So for example, if X was predicted but Y occurred, then an error is passed up, just sort of signaling that divergence between the prediction and what actually came in. And typically it's thought that predictions are the agent or the cognitive system's contribution, as it were. They're sourced from the agent or cognitive system, while errors are taken to be the contribution of the environment. An error signal is effectively a sensory signal. So you have expectations about the nature of things, and then you get sensory feedback telling you whether or to what extent that prediction was correct. That's the basic idea, and an important aspect of all of this is the concept of precision weighting, and it will be very important for what follows. And precision weighting, because there are so many predictions and errors being passed throughout the system, it's very hard for the system to get some kind of coherent plan of attack or plan of action, and precision weighting is meant to be deployed to help that happen. So rather than having to deal with all these predictions and errors, the brain might tighten precision on some predictions, give very little precision to other errors, and just let the predictions do the bulk of the work, and that makes things manageable. And you can kind of see what it does in this diagram. The details aren't really important, but what's important is you can see the posterior, which we can consider as the prediction for present purposes, really. It's not really that's the case. When, depending on whether there's more precision accorded to the sensory evidence, that is the errors, or the priors, that is the predictions, the probability distribution, or what's ultimately concluded, can change in different ways. So you should see from the diagram how the posterior is in one place and then another, and then it has a different shape based on how precision weighting is altered. Again, the details aren't important, but it should be clear from that precision is kind of how precision is weighted, changes how everything else happens, and that will affect how predictions and expectations unfold. So that's the basics of predictive processing. Now to my specific take on it. Well, effectively, I like predictive processing because I think it operationalizes Merleau-Ponty's concept of grip. So Merleau-Ponty effectively said that whenever you engage in minded activities, you're always gravitating towards an optimal or maximal grip upon your surroundings. You're always gravitating toward optimal positions in space, and that this gravitation is guided by affective feelings, felt tensions, and felt pulls. A good way that that's explained is an example from Hubbard Dreyfus and Sean Kelly, and they talk about how if you walk into an elevator, you just sort of naturally gravitate towards an optimal space in the elevator. You know not to stand too close to other people, and if you do, things feel a bit strange, and because they feel a bit strange, you'll take a step back, and then things feel a bit better. And the idea from Merleau-Ponty is that is how minded activity proceeds all of the time. You're always trying to arrive at optimal perspectives, and you get effective feedback telling you whether or not you're doing so. And basically, I think grip makes a lot of sense, and it's phenomenologically very plausible. But what's great about predictive processing is you might think it operationalizes grip or explains the underlying rationale of grip. So it might be essentially the aim of the predictive brain is to minimize long-term prediction error. That's what's optimal for the brain. And that might be what we're tracking, or Merleau-Ponty was talking about when he talked about optimal grip. The reason that you arrive at this optimal place in the elevator is because you're trying to minimize long-term prediction error, and that's the best way to do it. And I'll mention in a second where affect comes into this story. But before I do so, just another point about this idea. If you have predictive processing operationalizing grip, at least in the way that I think of it, you get an account of extensive consciousness, wherein conscious experience is constituted by brain, body, and world. It's not that experience occurs inside the head or is located inside the brain and represents things external. It's that whenever you interact with the world and are conscious of it, the things you interact with and your body itself are constituent of that experience. So the people in the elevator, for example, form constituent parts of your experience. You directly interact with them. This is the picture that's painted by grip, and on my view of predictive processing, predictive processing is the kind of thing that enables brain-based activity that allows you to grip the world. So if you're familiar with the Andy Clark's extended mind thesis, you might think of my view as basically an extended consciousness thesis, that you don't need to represent cups in the world, or you don't need to consciously represent cups when you perceive they exist there. So all your brain needs to do is enable you to latch on to them, essentially, and predictive processing explains how that happens. And I call it extensive consciousness because the idea is that this is happening all the time, and it might only be rarely that you do represent things. So Andy Clark basically argues for this, except not for consciousness in his book. Michael Kirchhoff and Julian Kiverstein have a book arguing for a similar idea, although theirs might be slightly different. I'm not sure, but that's the idea anyway. So two key aspects of this effective grip idea. One, and I don't need to talk about this much because we talked about it a lot in the last talk, You might think that precision weighting is effectively guided. Kiverstein, Miller, and Rietveld's idea is that effectively valenced experience provide feedback on our rate of error reduction, whether we're doing well at reducing error or not, and that helps you alter precision weighting in response to it. So if you think back to the example of the elevator, whenever you walk in and you're standing too close to someone, that negative affective feeling that says something feels not quite right here, that's giving you feedback that you're not reducing error as optimally as possible. And it encourages you to take a step back. And when you do so, the negative feeling goes away. And that tells you, oh, you're back on track. You're minimizing error well again. And the idea is meant to be, at least as I understand Kiverstein, Miller, and Rietveld's idea, is that these affective feelings are helping you to change precision weighting on the fly so that you change your strategies or what you're doing and thereby minimize error overall better over time. And then the second idea that I will make use of, which I borrow from Andy Clark, is that this precision weighting and this effective alteration of precision weighting enables a flexible shift between non-representational and representational strategies. That is, precision weighting can allow you to be open to the world, as it were, and directly interact with it. But it can also change the weighting on your predictive architecture such that you become close to the world, as it were, and take to representing it. I'll develop that idea in a bit more detail shortly, but I borrow that from Clark, and basically the only difference between myself and Clark is that he thinks representation is required to subsequently form non-representational strategies, whereas I take it to be the other way around. You have the non-representational strategies first, and representational strategies are parasitic upon those. But we can talk about that in questions if you'd like anyway after. So yeah, having explained that, let's turn on to the neurophenomenological account of schizophrenia. So first of all, what is schizophrenia? I'm not sure this diagram is exactly accurate, though I'm not a clinician, but basically schizophrenia, it captures most of the things, and basically schizophrenia is meant to be characterized by positive, negative, and cognitive symptoms. The positive symptoms are so called because they constitute additions to non-schizophrenic experience, or things that are not typically experienced by people without schizophrenia. And the classic examples there are hallucinations and delusions. So, for example, you might hallucinate God or angels speaking to you and perhaps see them out of the corner of your eye. You might also have a long-standing delusion or a narrative that God is watching you intently and giving you instructions and wants you to do certain things. And these positive symptoms seem to be just paradigmatic representation hungry symptoms. Delusions are linguistic narratives that are quite rich. It's hard to explain language without thinking of it in representational terms, or at least most people would assume that language is representational. Likewise, hallucinations of God or angels, which aren't actually present in the room, seem to represent things that aren't there. Again, representation hungry. Negative symptoms essentially are characterized by a withdrawal from the world, essentially, or a lack of liveliness or engagement with the world. They're not as clearly representation hungry, but they might give rise to representation hungry kinds of experiences. I won't go into that now, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. And then cognitive symptoms, which I take, disorganized speech would be one of, although again, I'm not a clinician, but they're meant to be problems with cognition, essentially, problems with thought and language and memory. They also affect people with schizophrenia. And again, the idea might be, well, these are probably representation hungry because something like thought or something like language, it seems to involve language, which is representational, or it seems to involve something internal that stands for something external outside the head. So again, it seems representation hungry. But the idea basically is that is what schizophrenia is, and it does seem to be a paradigmatic instance of representation hunger. So how could a non-representational account, for example, of the kind that I offered with, predictive processing, how could that account for it? Well, this is what I propose, and the proposal begins with a phenomenological account is relatively old now, but still I think is quite well known, which is Louis Sass and Joseph Parnas' account. And they say that what is fundamental to schizophrenia, or what marks it out despite its heterogeneities and that kind of thing, is that there's just a fundamental dissolution in the sense of self, or a sense of subjectivity. That's what's characteristic of schizophrenia. Typically, whenever you experience things, there's a sense of mindness or for me-ness, or subjectivity of some kind, a basic sense of self that tells you this experience is mine and I am interacting with the world. And what's meant to happen in schizophrenia is that that just gets lost and completely dissolved. More precisely, what happens is that rather than just being directly absorbed in minded activities and engaging in them absorbedly, people with schizophrenia tend to inhabit a more sort of detached perspective upon their activities, as if they were viewing someone else performing these activities, or as if it wasn't them that performed them. And I think this picture it doesn't really, but the picture sort of gets across the idea here. If you think of the picture these people are looking upon as kind of absorbed interaction with the environment, wherein people are just viewing a painting, and then the sort of people who are looking at this painting, that might sort of represent the meta perspective adopted by someone who has schizophrenia. So for a more concrete thing, it might be, instead of just reaching out for a glass and picking it up, a person with schizophrenia might have to think a lot about what they're doing to pick it up. And their picking up the glass has this sort of detached perspective upon it. And if you have that view, Sass and Parnas say the key aspect of schizophrenia and its different symptoms, it's not that there are additions to experience or privations of experience. It's just that experience is more or less as it usually is, but it's experienced from a different kind of perspective. And that's why it seems different, which I'll come back to in a second. And finally, Sass and Parnas, an important point of their account, is the delusional mood, which they say constitutes a crucial and overlooked precursor to the emergence of psychosis. I'm not a clinician, so I'm not sure how correct Sass and Parnas are, especially 17 years after their paper is published, whether delusional mood is overlooked. The idea is meant to be that before developing full-blown psychosis, people with schizophrenia often report a kind of subtle change in their experience, or a background change. Things feel awry or not quite right, and this continues over time, and that is what eventually develops into full-blown psychosis, wherein the symptoms are exhibited. So that's a key part for Sass and Parnas, but that's the idea, the phenomenological account, which, although I'm not an expert on phenomenological psychopathology, I take it it's quite typical for these kinds of accounts. The idea is meant to be that you move from having being a body to having a body mode of experience, and this is what kind of Sass and Parnas are talking about. But yeah, that's the Ipseity disturbance account. Moving on to predictive processing. Predictive processing has only really recently been applied to schizophrenia, but already there's a pretty standard explanation of schizophrenia. I've included a quotation here from a recent review article, which gives you the summary of it. And I've highlighted the important points in white. So in order, basically, predictive processing typically says schizophrenia, what happens is that there's aberrant precision weighting. The precision assigned to predictions and prediction errors is not what would usually be assigned to them. It's awry or aberrant in some way, and that's why you get these symptoms. That's why schizophrenia occurs. More specifically, it's typically thought that first, error signals, that is sensory feedback, are assigned an extremely high amount of weight. They're made extremely precise in a bid to reduce overall prediction error. This doesn't really work to reduce overall prediction error. So to overcome this problem, high-level predictions are subsequently accorded a really high weighting in the architecture, and that's meant to overcome the really strongly weighted error signals. And whenever you have whatever mixture of precision weighting you end up with, that explains the symptomatic profile. So just as an example, the idea might be something like error signals or sensory signals are accorded far too high weighting. in a bid to reduce overall prediction error, because a lot of error is being signaled for some unknown reason when it shouldn't be. And in response to that, the system then assigns extremely high amounts of precision to predictions. So it might be that the reason you hallucinate God speaking to you in the corner of the room is that the error sensory signals have been assigned too much precision, and predictions are assigned high precision in response to this. They overcome the weight of the error signal and result in what results is that a prediction of God and of speech and so on overwhelms the sensory signal. Error does not get fed back into it. It's allowed to pass through the system. And so a prediction is created of God speaking to you, and that's why you experience that hallucination. And you might think that this might explain why Sass and Parnas' account, why it happens, because the idea is that generally the same kind of predictive activity is occurring, but it results in different things, or it occurs in a different kind of way, and that's why experiences might be different. I can go into more detail with that in the Q&A, because it kind of depends on the precise thing you're talking about. But a lot of predictive processing explanations in this area, especially regarding action, they seem to sort of highlight that the same gross motor activities can be performed, but the manner in which they're performed is different, and that's why you might have different experiences. But I'll get back to that later in any case. And so then the neurophenomenological account, I don't really think there's anything special about this or unique to me, but I basically just think that, as with grip being explainable in terms of predictive processing, I think these phenomenological accounts seem to make a lot of sense within predictive accounts. So you can just combine an account like Sass and Parnas's with a predictive processing account. So more specifically, I would take as a basis for this account that non-schizophrenic experience might be characterized by grip. That is, in everyday experience, the predictive architecture enables a grip on the world, and you directly interact with objects and people and things in your environment. Then, whenever delusional mood sets in, which, as we saw, Sass and Parnas take to be really important a really important precursor for schizophrenia in psychosis developing, you might think that what delusional mood signifies is that there's a loosening of grip. So the idea there might be that, because it signifies a loosening of grip because there's more error than expected being signaled. And this gives rise to a very subtle, but nevertheless pervasive negative feeling, which just tells the system that rates of error reduction are reducing over time. So the idea might be something like this. For whatever reason, more error than expected is being signaled. And this is presumably due to, we don't know what causes schizophrenia, but it's presumably due to whatever the neurocomputational architectures, whatever malfunction is happening there, that causes a spark of error that shouldn't be there. And so error is being signaled over time. Because error is being signaled over time and it's more error than expected, the rate of error reduction is always nosediving. It's getting worse and worse. And if you go back to Kiverstein-Eyol's hypothesis, that should result in a negatively valence feeling, which tells you error reduction isn't working as it should. We need to change things up by altering precision weighting. And then you might think of the sort of process of delusional mood as the gradual inability to reduce error, and things get worse and worse and feel more and more negative because error is just constantly being signaled, and you're literally, well, figuratively, I guess, loosening your grip on the world. You're just slipping away from the way you used to be able to grip the world. That's why it feels bad. That's why things feel awry. And then consequently, or after this, after a while, when enough precision weighting alteration is happening and none of it works, you get to the point where grip is almost completely lost. And that's where the psychotic symptoms of schizophrenia emerge, the positive and negative and cognitive symptoms. And the idea there might be that the delusional mood is this precursor period, and then precision weighting has just been configured in a really aberrant way, and that results in certain experiences. So, for example, just to take an example, which, again, from what I gather, each case is different, so you can't really say there's a pathway from A to B, but just as a representative example, some people say that there's a delusional mood, and in that stage, things seem awry, and then they saw certain objects or certain things that seemed very salient or important for some reason, and then subsequently they started to develop convoluted delusions, and with that came hallucinatory experiences. And in this account, the idea might be something like a lot of error is being signaled, precision weighting is being heightened on the sensory signals or the error signals. That's what the typical predictive processing story says. And that's why certain sensory signals just seem really salient or important. And subsequent to this, because that doesn't help reduce error, more high-level predictions are given increased precision, and they're allowed to overwhelm the system in response to this. And that's why the more delusional aspects and the hallucinations might develop. So that's something like the idea. And if something like that is the case or works, what does that say about this representational status of psychosis? Well, effectively, I think what's happening here is that there's a move from a non-representational to a representational way of being. And my argument for this proceeds in two steps. I'm not so sure how crucial the first step is, but I would appreciate any comments on that if you have any thoughts. But the first step is this. In optimal grip, when things are going well, you're directly related to the world, as I said. So you directly interact with objects in the world that are around you, and they are constitutive of the experience themselves, or partially constitutive. And if that's the case, Gibson, the ecological psychologist, had this idea that perception is inherently relational, and that being so, your perception of the world always tells you as much about your position in that world as the position of the things you are perceiving. So, for example, if you take a look at the cat, it's not just that your perception of the cat tells you the cat is on the bed and it's sitting on all fours and it looks kind of bemused, I guess. It also tells you what your perspective on the cat is as well. So for example, it tells you that the cat is looking up at you, that it's sitting close to you, it's within range for petting, that kind of thing. And the idea effectively is that in optimal grip, there's this Gibsonian self-specification going on. So just as you're directly related to the world, that relation tells you about the nature of your position in that world. And if you think that and have this idea as grip deteriorating in schizophrenia, this idea, it might be that the reason that in schizophrenia, this sense of self is gradually becomes deteriorated and then eventually lost, is simply that you lose the ability to directly relate to the world or to grip it. And so self-specification breaks down. So the idea might be that when grip is lost, you cannot directly relate to the cat. So the normal self-specification breaks down and you just have this sort of detached perspective upon your experience of the cat. And that's why you've lost your sense of self, as it were. That's the idea. It might be somewhat speculative, and you might wonder, well, why is that relevant to representation anyway? But I think the reason that this might happen is that there's a change in the function of the predictive processing system that enables grip, and it starts to represent things, and that's why the self-specification is lost. So why do I think this? Well, essentially the argument, and this is probably the key part of the argument, it relies on William Ramsey's job description challenge. William Ramsey said, if you want to determine whether a given cognitive entity plays a representational or non-representational function in a cognitive system, take a prototypical representation, something that everyone would agree is a representation, and then ask, does this cognitive entity play that role? If it does, it deserves to be explained in terms of representation. And if it does not, it does not. So, for example, maps are representations. Someone says that there are cognitive maps in the brain. Then what you do is look at the functional role maps typically play when humans use them. See if that function is played within the brain. If it is, these cognitive maps are representational. If it does not, then it's a misnomer to call them that. And I've argued in previous work, so I'm just kind of rehearsing that work here, that in everyday experience, everyday grip, predictive processing can be explained entirely in terms of causal covariation and or biasing functions, and none of this requires ascribing representation, so it's non-representational. In a bit more detail, predictions pass down errors to layers of the hierarchy right next to them. Errors pass error signals up. So the whole functioning of predictions and errors can be explained purely in terms of causal covariation between one part of the hierarchy and the next. It's pretty much everyone grants that causal covariation is not sufficient for representation. So predictions and errors are not representational. And you might think, well, predictions and errors, those are representational terms that came up in the questions, but the idea there might be, it's kind of a misnomer to call them predictions and errors, really. So we're just using instrumentally useful or heuristic language there, but really there's only causal covariation going on, so no representation. Precision weighting, meanwhile, you might think of as playing a biasing function. So if you take, say, irrigation channels in a farmer's field, you can bias the flow of water so that it flows a little bit or a lot, so that it flows in great strength or its strength is weakened, just by biasing how the water flows through certain channels. No one would want to say that irrigation channels represent things. At least it's not clear you would want to say that. This being the case, I essentially think precision weighting works that way. So while precision weighting might, it alters the flow or strength of certain prediction signals or error signals and affects how they propagate through the hierarchy. But these precision weighting mechanisms are playing a similar role to an irrigation channel, so they should neither be explained in terms of representation. So if that's the case, the PP architecture itself should not be explained in terms of representation. And more broadly, if there's an embodied agent acting directly with the world, and the things they perceive, say, are things like cups and glasses, which are directly present in the world, there's no need to posit representation because they can serve as their own best model, as Rodney Brooks once said. And if that's the case, then PP functioning is completely non-representational. However, when grip is lost, I think something important changes. And specifically, it's the role of predictions that becomes important and that changes importantly. Like I said, the classic predictive processing explanation of schizophrenia says that after error signals have been given too much weight, predictions are given an extremely high weighting in response to this. And their weighting is so high that they effectively are allowed to propagate throughout the hierarchy and do whatever they want. And this means that they're no longer constrained by the world. It's not like in the usual case where predictions causally covary with errors and there's a nice sort of system of causal covariation between the brain and the body and the world. It's rather that the brain is just doing its own thing now. These predictions are just doing whatever they want. And when if that's being the case, it seems that they become functionally detached from extraneural states of affairs or otherwise stand in for them. And that seems to be a representational job description. So to make this a bit clearer, if you think about the typical explanation of hallucination, where predictions have been accorded such a high weighting that they cannot be overruled by error signals. They're just so strong, they can do whatever they want. This is meant to result in experiences like hallucinations because predictions that God is in the corner of the room or that the Queen is speaking to me or something like that, they can't be overwritten or constrained by worldly feedback. And that's why they're present. And if that's the case, it seems that predictions have become functionally detached from the sort of extraneural world and they do their own thing and they stand in for other states of affairs, and that's why they're representational. I hope that makes sense, but again, you can ask me more questions if it didn't. But the idea there is essentially when grip is lost, specifically predictions have become assigned such a high precision that the PP system sort of retreats to within the brain. And so whenever there's engagements between brain, body, and world, rather than there being direct fluid engagements, it's rather the brain is representing these things. And that might be why schizophrenia, it seems that you're viewing yourself from a meta perspective, because instead of directly engaging in skillful interactions between the embodied interactions with the world, you represent yourself trying to engage in these embodied interactions, and that makes a difference. And the reasoning for that this happens is that there's a change in the functional job description of the predictive processing hierarchy. So that I hope that makes clear, but just to put it in a bit more simpler terms, in grip, there might be a cup there and you just directly interact with it, no representation required. But whenever grip has been lost and predictions are assigned a really high precision, it might be that you can predict a cup even though there's no cup present, and that will be experienced nonetheless. And it seems in that case, the really precise predictions serve a representational role of standing in for. So that's the idea, and that is meant to explain why there is a move from a non-representational way of being when grip is held to a representational way of being when it's lost. So what are the consequences for this? First of all, I think what you get is anti-intellectualist positive disjunctivism. That's a bit of a mouthful, but the basic idea is that positive disjunctivism says that there's a metaphysical distinction between perceptual and non-perceptual experiences, and that you can provide a positive characterization of both. On my account, there is a metaphysical distinction because in grip, experience is constituted by brain, body, and world. That's the extensive consciousness thesis. Whereas in a loss of grip, experience is rather constituted by a brain-based representation of brain, body, and world. So some of these experiences constitutively involve brain, body, and world. The others only really constitutively involve the brain. That's why there's a metaphysical distinction between the two. But interestingly, on this view, grip, which is a perceptual experience essentially, involves non-representational knowledge how, and its loss involves representational knowledge that. So if you take this view, it looks like the disjunctivist metaphysical distinction between non-perceptual and perceptual experience is just grounded upon the commonly accepted metaphysical distinction between knowledge how and knowledge that. I think that's independently interesting because a lot of people are quite wary of disjunctivist arguments for there being a metaphysical distinction between these types of experience. But most people quite forthrightly accept that knowledge how and know that are metaphysically distinct. So if you can ground disjunctivism on into anti-intellectualism, it might make it more palatable to a lot of people. And as for the scaling up problem, well, I think largely because I've accepted representation about a lot of things, that the PP account that I proffer doesn't really have to worry about the scaling up problem for two reasons. First of all, the account is as equally strong and or toothless as representational rivals when it comes to accounting for schizophrenia's representation-hungry symptoms. And what I mean by that is essentially because I've accepted representationalism about schizophrenia, whatever a representational predictive processing account says about schizophrenia, I can more or less adopt within my own account. So I can take their strengths, and also I inherit their weaknesses. But in this situation, I think that's a good thing. So, for example, my account doesn't really explain anything about delusions. It doesn't really say anything about cognitive systems. It doesn't really say anything about language in general, which is true. And Dan Williams has a nice paper on this in Synthesa, I believe. He's got a nice paper which argues, well, actually representational accounts of predictive processing or predictive processing accounts in general, they also struggle to accommodate language and thought and those kind of things and concepts. So that my account doesn't speak to these kind of things isn't really a problem for it in comparison to its representational rivals within predictive processing. Or turning to another sort of standard problem, there's a Cartesian theater issue for most accounts which are realist about what it is like to experience, which phenomenological accounts are, in that you need to be able to explain the nature of experience without positing a Cartesian theater within the brain, a kind of projector in the brain to whom the experience is projected. Again, my account doesn't really say anything on that issue. It doesn't resolve the Cartesian theater issue for the hallucinatory experiences, which I accept are representational. But nevertheless, this problem is equally applies to rival representational predictive processing accounts, in which case my account, it doesn't really explain the problem, but neither do its rivals. So the scaling up problem affects us both equally and essentially. But having said that, you might think that actually my account is to be preferred to a more traditional representational rival because it allows for a pragmatic sidestepping of representation hunger. And the reason I say that is that on my account, grip is explanatorily essential for all things. When things are going well, grip explains that. And when things don't go well and say schizophrenia develops, that's explained in terms of a loss of grip. and the precise characteristics of schizophrenia are explained to ensue from the precise manner in which grip has been lost, in which the precision weighting alteration has occurred, and so on. But if that's the case, it's not so much that you need to explain the representation hungry experiences like delusions and hallucinations, because they are in a sense sort of epiphenomenal artifacts or side effects of this more fundamental loss of grip. And if that's the case, you might then think, well, my account just emphasizes grip. We can explain that in non-representational terms. And even the representational hungry experiences, they are byproducts of a loss of grip. And to study a loss of grip, you don't really need to worry so much about the representational things. You're just focusing on grip and what's gone wrong for it to be lost. And that might give you, albeit admittedly, a pragmatic sidestepping, or you might say I've just kind of evaded the issue unfairly, but you might think, well, for certain aspect, that's actually better because then we don't need to worry about these concerns. So yeah, to sum up that point, at the very least, my account might be on the same boat as other rival representational views, or it might even be better because its non-representational credentials allow it to explain a lot of things and to sort of sidestep the more problems of representation hunger. So it seems at the very least that the scaling up problem, which is meant to be really problematic for inactive kind of accounts and accounts of grip, isn't really applicable to my account, or it's not the massive problem that's typically thought to be. And yeah, just to sum up then, in conclusion, essentially my idea has been that predictive grip constitutes a non-representational relation between embodied agent and environment. The body and environment are partially constitutive of consciousness. Then when a loss of grip occurs, when that occurs, the system takes to representing extraneural states of affairs. And so conscious experiences are constituted by brain-based representations. But in short, in non-schizophrenic experience, there is no representation. In the experiences characteristic of schizophrenia, there is representation. That might be actually fine on an inactive account, and especially regarding the problem of representation hunger, you might just be happy with that because you can sort of avoid many of the problems that are usually applied to non-representational accounts by accepting representation, whilst also kind of sidestepping them. But yeah, it's just 2 minutes over time, so we'll stop there, and hopefully that made sense. And yeah, looking forward to your questions.